Welcome to Sci-Fi Alien, where the unknown becomes the adventure of a lifetime. What if the enemy you've always fought against was the one you needed to save? Imagine being caught between duty and an unexpected alliance, fighting not just for survival, but for something greater than yourself. What happens when two beings from opposite sides of an endless war are forced to join forces? How far will they go to break the chains of conflict? Stay with us as we explore the depths of survival, betrayal, and unity, in a world where nothing is what it seems. Are you ready for the truth? The battlefield was a place of nightmares, a cruel testament to the brutal reality of war. The air was thick with smoke, acrid from the fires that had consumed everything in their path. Bodies lay scattered across the barren landscape, some charred beyond recognition, others broken and lifeless. The distant roar of explosions echoed through the air, each one a reminder of the violence that surrounded them. For Jordan, a soldier in the 103rd Battalion, this was nothing new. He had seen it all before, the blood, the death, the destruction. But nothing in his years of service had prepared him for the moment he encountered her. He was on a routine patrol when it happened. The mission had seemed straightforward enough: assess the enemy's movements along the contested border of New Anchorage. It was supposed to be just another day in the trenches, another mission that would pass without incident. But as Jordan moved through the wreckage of what had once been a thriving military transport, something caught his eye. There, lying in the debris, was a figure that didn't belong, a massive, broken form, almost too alien to comprehend. His heart stopped. It was an arachnid queen, a creature from the enemy's ranks, left for dead after a vicious internal assault. At first, Jordan thought it might be a trick. Perhaps it was some sort of decoy, a bait set by the enemy to lure them into an ambush. But as he approached cautiously, his mind raced. This wasn't a trap. The creature was real, too real. Its body, covered in a hard exoskeleton, was cracked and oozing a strange blue fluid that stained the dirt around it. 6 long limbs, each one twitching in pain, struggled to move, but the queen's body was failing her. Her eyes, large, multifaceted, and eerily intelligent, were wide open, staring directly at him. Despite the terror she represented, there was something in those eyes that stopped him dead in his tracks: fear, pain, recognition. He couldn't be sure, but in that moment, he wasn't just looking at an enemy. He was looking at a living, breathing being. Jordan's breath caught in his throat. His training had drilled into him the importance of eliminating threats, of killing enemies without hesitation. But as he stood there, rifle in hand, he couldn't pull the trigger. His hand trembled. This wasn't a faceless alien, this was a queen, a leader in her own right. And she was dying in front of him. In that moment, something shifted inside him. His instincts as a soldier, honed through countless battles, told him to kill her. That was the mission, after all. That was the purpose of his existence, to fight and destroy the enemy. But another part of him, something deeper and more instinctual, told him to do something different. He had seen death countless times, had been to the brink of it himself more than once, but this felt different. For a brief second, Jordan hesitated, unsure of what to do. The sounds of the battle raged in the distance, the crackling of gunfire and the pounding of artillery only growing louder. The choice before him was stark: eliminate this creature and continue the fight, or show mercy, despite everything he had been taught. It was the kind of decision that could change everything. He didn't know what made him do it, but he lowered his rifle and began to approach her. Each step felt heavy, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen countless wounded soldiers before, but never an enemy like this, never someone who could be his equal in some way. As he knelt down beside her, he could hear her labored breathing, the raspy, almost human-like sound of distress. She was still alive, barely, but alive nonetheless. "Stay still," Jordan whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could even understand him. Her mandibles twitched slightly, as if she understood what he was saying, but she didn't respond. Instead, her massive eyes locked onto his, and in that brief moment, there was something there, something that made him feel like they were no longer two enemies on opposite sides of a war. They were two beings, caught in a system neither of them had chosen. Her body was heavy, but Jordan carefully began to lift her, his arms supporting her weight as he tried to make her as comfortable as possible. It was an impossible task. Her exoskeleton, though sturdy, was cracked in several places, and every movement caused her to twitch in pain. He gritted his teeth as he adjusted her position, taking great care not to jostle her too much. For a creature so massive, she was surprisingly light, but the weight of her injuries made every step feel like a battle in itself. As he lifted her, a strange thought crossed his mind: this wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be doing this. But despite the confusion swirling in his mind, something else was clear. He couldn't leave her here to die. He couldn't walk away and just pretend that this was another faceless enemy fallen in battle. He had to help her. With his sidearm in hand, Jordan moved cautiously, keeping his eyes on the horizon. The battle was still raging in the distance, but for now, he had no choice but to focus on getting the Queen to safety. The enemy would be on high alert, and he could already hear the distant sounds of approaching footfalls. His heart beat faster. He had no idea what he was doing, but he knew he couldn't leave her behind. He took one final look at the battlefield behind him. The smoke, the flames, the wreckage. It all seemed so distant now, as if it belonged to a different world. Here, in the midst of it all, he was doing something no soldier had ever been trained to do. He wasn't just surviving the war. He was trying to end it, in his own way, with this act of mercy. As the distance between them and the battle grew, Jordan's mind wandered. What would happen when he got her to safety? What would they do once they were out of enemy territory? Would she survive? Would he? Could he really bring an enemy queen back to his own people without the consequences being catastrophic? But for now, those questions didn't matter. All that mattered was the Queen, Thorexia. And as Jordan moved forward, carrying the weight of this impossible decision, he couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if peace was possible, not through destruction, but through understanding? This one act of mercy, this one decision to help, had already begun to change everything. The decision to save her was not an easy one. Jordan stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his weapon in his hands feeling as heavy as the very air around him. The battlefield, which had once been a familiar and comforting place of certainty, had now become a confusing blur of noise, chaos, and uncertainty. He could hear the distant sounds of explosions, the cries of soldiers, and the unmistakable hum of approaching combat aircraft. But despite the noise, despite the mission and the orders that weighed on his mind, all Jordan could focus on was the figure before him. The creature lying broken in front of him was not just any enemy. She was the Queen, the leader of the Arachnid forces, a symbol of the very thing he had been trained to fight. The urge to pull the trigger, to end her life, was instinctual. It was what any soldier would do. The enemy was on the brink of death, vulnerable, and Jordan had been taught that the quickest way to survive was to eliminate the threat. But in this moment, something in him resisted. He studied her for a long time, the silence between them louder than any explosion. She lay there, her limbs twisted in ways that should have been impossible, her once powerful exoskeleton cracked and leaking blue fluid. Her breathing was ragged, labored, but she was still alive, and in her eyes, there was something that made him pause. She wasn't just a monster, as the propaganda had taught him to think. She was a creature, a living being, caught in the same deadly game of survival. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. This was not just an enemy, this was someone who had been thrust into a war she didn't choose any more than he had. Jordan had always thought of the war in terms of sides, humans versus arachnids, good versus evil. But standing here now, looking at the Queen, those lines began to blur. Her suffering was as real as any human's. The blood that seeped from her wounds wasn't any less real because she was his enemy. In fact, the sight of it brought an uncomfortable knot to his stomach. This was a being, just like him, thrown into a war that had become far bigger than both of them. He felt a surge of compassion, something he had never expected to feel for the enemy. The Queen had no reason to trust him, no reason to expect anything but death. But despite her circumstances, there was a moment of quiet understanding between them. It was as if she, too, saw the futility of the violence, the endless bloodshed that had defined their lives. In her eyes, he didn't see hatred or fear, but a reflection of the same exhaustion he felt inside. This war had worn them both down to nothing more than survivors. The sound of distant gunfire snapped him back to reality. Jordan knew he didn't have much time. The enemy would be closing in, and if he didn't act quickly, they would both be dead. The decision that lay before him was monumental. He could leave her to die, end the threat, and follow through with the mission. But something inside him resisted. Was this really the way it had to end? Was this the only option? Jordan's gaze flickered down to his rifle, still gripped in his hands. He could feel the weight of it, the pressure to do what he had been trained to do. But then his eyes returned to the Queen, and a wave of something stronger than duty washed over him, something that made his fingers loosen their grip on the weapon. He had always thought of himself as a soldier first and foremost, but in this moment, the soldier within him faded, and something else took its place. What if this moment could be different? What if there was another way? He could see her, this being, this Queen, who was as much a product of circumstance as he was, and he realized that this wasn't just about survival. This was about a chance for something beyond the cycle of violence. He had been given a choice, to continue the war, to perpetuate the destruction, or to try something impossible, something human. He chose to act with compassion. He chose to give her a chance to survive, not as an enemy, but as someone who had been hurt by the same war they both fought. With a deep breath, Jordan made his decision. He would not kill her. He would save her. The weight of his decision hit him almost immediately, and the gravity of it made his limbs feel heavy. He bent down slowly, cautiously, making sure not to cause her more pain. The Queen's eyes flickered briefly, and for the first time since he had seen her, he noticed something like a flicker of surprise. Perhaps she hadn't expected mercy. Or perhaps, in the face of death, mercy was a foreign concept. But there was no time for questions, no time for second thoughts. Jordan gently lifted her, adjusting her weight carefully in his arms. She was surprisingly light for her size, but the injuries she had sustained made her fragile, and with each step he took, his heart pounded faster. The terrain was rough, and the sounds of battle grew louder in the distance. But he didn't look back. There was no going back now. He was carrying an enemy Queen across a war-torn landscape, and he wasn't sure how he would explain this to his superiors, to his fellow soldiers, to anyone. But none of that mattered. In that moment, there was only the Queen, fragile and broken, and the choice he had made to help her survive. For the first time in a long while, Jordan wasn't sure of anything. The rules of war had been turned upside down. He wasn't fighting to survive in the traditional sense. He wasn't driven by the same hatred or duty that had fueled his actions for so long. He was simply acting because it felt right. And for the first time, he questioned the very nature of the war. Was this what it had all been for? Was there no other way than to kill? Was mercy really an option in a world defined by conflict? As he trudged through the ruins of the battlefield, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness, Jordan felt something shift inside of him. This wasn't the war he had signed up for. This wasn't the fight he had been trained for. But in saving this Queen, in making the choice to show mercy, he realized that he had begun to fight for something far greater than survival. He was fighting for a future where this madness, this cycle of violence, didn't have to be the end of the story. It was a fight for a better tomorrow, one where compassion, understanding, and perhaps even love could emerge from the ashes of war. In the distance, the sounds of battle continued to rage, but Jordan didn't look back. There was no time for the past. There was only the future, and the choices he would make to shape it. And as he moved forward, with the enemy Queen in his arms, Jordan knew that he had just made the most important decision of his life. It was a decision that would change everything. The first few hours of their journey together were filled with nothing but silence and tension. The air around them seemed thick with distrust, as if the weight of their past actions hung between them like an invisible wall. Jordan, still reeling from the decision he had made to save her, didn't know what to expect. The enemy Queen, Thorexia, lay in his arms, her massive form surprisingly light but frail, her body cracked and oozing blue fluid. Every step he took was a reminder of the strange and impossible choice he had made. Thorexia, for her part, seemed to do little more than breathe. She didn't speak, didn't move much, as though she were too weak to do anything but endure. Jordan couldn't bring himself to look at her directly, but he could feel her presence, and the knowledge that he was carrying an enemy who had been responsible for so much destruction, pressed heavily on his mind. Every few steps, he glanced at her, half expecting her to lash out, half expecting her to try and escape. But instead, she merely rested in his arms, her body growing warmer with each passing moment. She was alive, but barely. There were times when Jordan would feel the tension between them dissipate, if only slightly. As he navigated the treacherous terrain, taking great care not to jostle her too much, he would feel her eyes on him, watching. The moment their gazes would meet, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something almost human. It was the briefest moment of recognition, of understanding, that made Jordan pause every time. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't anger. It was something else. A shared understanding that neither of them belonged here, in this place, in this war. By the time they had made it through the first few miles, Jordan started to notice something about her, something that transcended the pain and fear he had originally associated with her. There was a quiet strength in the way she endured, an unspoken resilience that mirrored his own. Thorexia had been born into war, just like him, but the way she held herself, even in her broken state, spoke volumes about her survival instinct. She wasn't just a symbol of destruction. She wasn't just the enemy. She was a being who had fought for her life, just as he had fought for his. But the more Jordan observed her, the more he realized that there was something even deeper at play between them. He had been trained to hate the arachnids, to see them as nothing more than enemies to be destroyed. His entire life had been defined by the black and white dichotomy of war, us versus them, good versus evil. But Thorexia wasn't just a them. She was different from the faceless masses he had been conditioned to fight. She was a leader, a queen of her kind, a symbol of the arachnid forces, and yet in this moment, she was nothing more than a wounded being trying to survive, just like him. He wasn't sure when it happened, but the shift in their dynamic started to take place quietly, almost imperceptibly. As the hours stretched on, Jordan began to notice the subtle changes in her. Her breathing, once strained, began to steady. The stiffness in her limbs started to ease, and the tension that had filled the air between them seemed to lessen with every passing mile. It was as though, despite the vast differences between them, they were beginning to form some kind of understanding. There was no room for hatred anymore, not between them. There was only the shared weight of survival. At one point, when they were resting for a brief moment by a small stream, Jordan had placed her down carefully, her massive frame resting against a large rock. As he knelt beside her, checking the makeshift bandages he had wrapped around her injuries, she turned her head slightly to look at him. It was the first time she had truly met his gaze since he had saved her, and for the first time, Jordan saw something in her eyes that he hadn't expected: vulnerability. It was fleeting, just a flash, but it was enough. Thorexia, despite her formidable nature, despite her position as a queen, was just like him. She was fighting to survive, to overcome the same fear that had plagued Jordan every time he had found himself at the mercy of his enemies. She wasn't just a monster, as he had been taught to believe. She was a person, with her own fears, her own pain, her own instincts. She was a survivor. In that moment, something clicked for Jordan. He had been carrying her for hours, but it wasn't just her physical weight that he had been bearing, it was the weight of everything they had both endured. The war, the loss, the destruction. And in that moment, he realized that they were no longer enemies locked in a battle of life and death. They were two beings, struggling against the same tide, each facing their own demons. They had been thrown together by fate, but it was their shared will to survive that was starting to bind them. As they continued their journey, their bond grew stronger. Thorexia, despite her condition, began to trust him more. She would occasionally shift in his arms, her movements becoming less rigid, more fluid. Jordan would catch her looking at him, sometimes with curiosity, other times with a quiet kind of respect. The silence between them, once filled with tension and uncertainty, began to feel more comfortable, more natural. They weren't speaking much, but their actions spoke volumes. They were working together, not against each other. One day, as they made their way through a dense forest, Jordan felt the first real moment of trust between them. He had been forced to move quickly, dodging enemy patrols and trying to stay one step ahead of the approaching danger. He needed to pick up the pace, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He glanced down at Thorexia, wondering how much longer she could go on. Without a word, she shifted in his arms, pushing herself upright. Her eyes locked with his, and for the first time, she spoke, "You must go faster." Her voice was weak, but it was still a command, the voice of a queen. "They are coming. You cannot afford to stop now." Jordan hesitated for a moment, but the weight of her words, the urgency in her voice, snapped him into action. He didn't question her. He didn't second-guess her judgment. He simply trusted her. They were no longer enemies. They were partners in survival, bound together by something greater than their differences. and in that moment, he realized that this journey had changed him in ways he could never have imagined. The unlikely bond that had formed between them was more than just an alliance, it was a partnership forged in the fires of war and survival. And as they moved forward, side by side, Jordan knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Their connection was no longer just a product of circumstance. It was a testament to the possibility of change, of reconciliation, even in the darkest of times. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to live together. The night had fallen quietly, and for the first time since their journey began, Jordan allowed himself a moment to breathe. The world around him had grown darker, and the distant sounds of battle had faded into the background, swallowed by the thick trees and the silence of their temporary haven. The tension, however, was far from gone. His thoughts churned, and with every step closer to their destination, every mile further away from the chaos they had escaped, the weight of their situation pressed down harder on him. They had reached the neutral trading post. It was supposed to be a safe place, somewhere they could rest and regroup before continuing their journey. The post had been established long ago as a meeting point for soldiers and civilians alike, a space for brief alliances and exchanges. But as Jordan glanced at Thorexia, who had once been his sworn enemy but was now silently resting beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His instincts screamed at him to stay alert. This wasn't the sanctuary it appeared to be. Thorexia, despite her injuries, seemed unusually quiet. She lay propped against a stack of crates, her breathing shallow, but steady. The light from the flickering lamps cast eerie shadows on her cracked exoskeleton, and Jordan found himself distracted by the strange tenderness he now felt for the creature that had once been his target. There was no denying the connection that had grown between them, a bond that had formed not just out of necessity, but from something deeper. Still, despite that bond, the fact remained, she was the enemy. And enemies didn't just change. They didn't suddenly become allies. The war between their kinds would never allow that. The moment of truth was fast approaching. The door to the trading post creaked open, and Jordan's muscles tensed. He instinctively moved closer to Thorexia, positioning himself between her and the new arrivals. His hand went to the sidearm strapped to his waist, though he knew that the situation wasn't going to be as simple as a confrontation. The people entering weren't soldiers. They were civilians, traders, nothing that would raise suspicion in the eyes of anyone else. But for Jordan, the moment they stepped in, his mind went into overdrive. His heart dropped when he saw the familiar face among them. One of the figures stepped forward, cloaked in the shadows of the doorway. The movement was deliberate, the pace slow, almost measured. It was a figure Jordan had hoped never to see again. It was Colonel Hayes. The same man who had trained him, who had led him into battle countless times, and whose commands Jordan had followed without question. The man who, in so many ways, had been a father figure to him. But now, as he stood before Jordan, Hayes was no longer the man he once trusted. There was no warmth in his eyes, no recognition of the bond they had shared as soldiers. Only cold calculation. "Surprised to see me?" Hayes's voice was steady, with an undercurrent of mockery. He didn't wait for Jordan's response. "You thought you could just run off with her? You really thought this peace experiment of yours would succeed?" Jordan's stomach tightened, and the words hung in the air like poison. The thought of Hayes being involved in whatever game was being played behind the scenes was a betrayal he hadn't even considered. The war had always been complicated, but this, the realization that someone he had once admired, respected, and even trusted, could turn against him, was a blow he had not prepared for. Why? Jordan's voice cracked, a mixture of disbelief and anger rising in his chest. Why would you do this? After everything we fought for, you're part of this. Colonel Hayes took a step forward, his expression hardening, but there was no regret in his eyes. The war is bigger than any of us, he said. You've been living in a dream, Jordan. Peace. It's an illusion. A facade. We're not here to end this war. We're here to control it. To make sure we're the ones holding the strings when it all comes crashing down. And you've been playing right into their hands, helping the enemy queen escape like some kind of naive fool. Jordan's mind raced. The words made sense in a way, but they didn't fit the person he knew Hayes to be. The man he had followed, the leader he had trusted, wasn't here anymore. In his place stood someone who had sold out, someone who had lost everything that once made him human. And then the full weight of it hit him. This wasn't just about peace. This wasn't just about the war. This was about power. The kind of power that would make all the bloodshed, all the lives lost, feel insignificant. The kind of power that made someone like Hayes believe that they could control everything, even the fates of entire species. Jordan's thoughts spiraled. His training had always been clear: destroy the enemy. End the threat. He had been conditioned to fight for his country, for his comrades. But now, standing face to face with the man who had taught him to fight, he saw something else, something darker. Hayes had never cared about the soldiers, about the people who died for his cause. It was always about control, about manipulation, about winning at any cost. You betrayed everything you once stood for, Jordan muttered, his voice barely a whisper. You're no different than the enemies we fight. You've become what you hated. For a moment, there was silence. Hayes didn't respond. His eyes didn't flicker with guilt or remorse. Instead, he simply stepped back, giving Jordan a cold smile. You'll understand eventually. You always do. But by then, it'll be too late. Jordan felt the sting of betrayal burn through him. He had once seen Hayes as a mentor, a guide through the darkest parts of the war. But now, he realized, everything had been a lie. The colonel had never cared about victory, or peace, or the lives of the soldiers. He had cared about control. He had cared about power. Without thinking, Jordan's hand tightened around the sidearm. Hayes was no longer his commander. He was just another enemy, another obstacle standing in the way of what needed to be done. But before he could act, something shifted in the room. Thorexia, who had been eerily silent throughout the confrontation, shifted slightly. Her eyes met Jordan's, and in that moment, he saw something new, something he hadn't expected. Thorexia's voice, weak but clear, broke the tension in the air. This war has never been about who wins, she said, her mandibles clicking softly as she spoke. It's about who controls the story. And right now, you're both just pawns in that game. The words hit Jordan like a wave crashing against the shore. He had been so focused on the immediate betrayal, the shock of facing Hayes as an enemy, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. Thorexia's words echoed in his mind. This war was not just about survival, or victory. It was about who told the story, who shaped the future, and who had the power to rewrite it. For the first time since this journey began, Jordan realized the true weight of the situation. This wasn't just about him, or Thorexia, or even the betrayal of a single man. This was about everything. And in that moment, standing with the enemy queen who had once been his target, Jordan understood what he had to do. The choice was clear, and the future was his to shape. The weight of Jordan's disbelief grew heavier as Colonel Hayes stood before him, his face hardened with a cold detachment. The moment felt suspended in time, as if the room itself had grown thicker with each word Hayes spoke. Jordan's chest tightened with confusion and anger. How had this happened? How had the man he once trusted, the man who had been a father figure in the darkest hours of battle, become the very thing he had always fought against? The realization that Hayes was no longer the person Jordan had once known hit him like a fist to the gut, but it wasn't until Hayes continued speaking that the true nature of the betrayal began to unravel. Hayes's words echoed in Jordan's mind, growing louder with each sentence. The war is bigger than you, Jordan. You've been living in a dream, thinking peace is an option, that we can simply stop fighting. But it's not that simple. Peace. It's a lie, a falsehood that only weakens us. The truth is, we've been manipulating both sides of this conflict for years, keeping it going because it serves us. Control. That's what this is really about. And you? You've been a pawn in a game you didn't even understand. The realization stung, sharper than any physical wound. Jordan's mind raced as the words sank in deeper, shattering everything he had believed. His entire life had been spent fighting for a cause he thought was noble, a cause he thought was rooted in honor. But Hayes, the man who had led him, had never cared about any of that. It wasn't about honor. It wasn't about the lives of the men and women under his command. It was about power. And in that moment, Jordan understood, the war was never meant to end. It was meant to be a means to an end, a tool to secure control, not just over territory, but over everything. Jordan's breath caught in his throat as Hayes took a step forward, his eyes narrowing with a cold, calculating gleam. You were always a good soldier, Jordan, he said, his voice dripping with a mixture of admiration and contempt. But you were too idealistic. You didn't see the bigger picture. The peace talks, the efforts to end the war, they were never going to work. I needed someone like you, someone who believed in those ideals, to get close to her. Hayes gestured toward Thorexia, his eyes darkening. You were so focused on the idea of peace that you didn't see how you were being used. You thought you were helping the queen. But she's nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. And now, you're part of the plan to secure our future. All of this, all of it was orchestrated from the very beginning. The words hit Jordan like a tidal wave, crashing over him with overwhelming force. The foundation of his entire existence, the very beliefs that had driven him to fight, crumbled beneath him. He had thought he was working toward a greater good, toward ending the bloodshed, toward making the world a better place. But now, it all felt like an illusion. Hayes had used him, manipulated him, just like everyone else in this war. His sense of purpose, his honor, his very identity, everything had been reduced to a lie. Jordan's fists clenched, his body trembling with the weight of the betrayal. He had trusted Hayes, trusted him with his life, his future. They had shared victories and losses, fought side by side in some of the most brutal battles of the war. How could this man, who had once been a mentor, a leader, become the very embodiment of everything Jordan had despised? How could he have been part of this grand deception? You didn't care about peace, did you? Jordan's voice broke through the chaos in his mind, his words rough with the bitterness that churned inside him. You never cared about the soldiers, about the lives lost. You were using us all for your own gain. For your own power. Hayes's face remained unreadable, a mask of indifference as he regarded Jordan. You don't understand, he said, his tone dismissive. You never understood the real game. The war? It's just a means to an end. We've been securing our position, ensuring that no matter who wins, we control everything. The Queen, the Arachnids, they were never the real threat. The real threat was always our inability to control the outcome. But now, with the Queen on our side, we have the leverage we need to finish this once and for all. It's over, Jordan. It's always been over. The finality in Hayes's voice hit Jordan like a slap, and for a moment, he could do nothing but stare at him, stunned. It was as if the man he had once known had been replaced by a stranger, someone entirely different, someone willing to sacrifice everything, including the lives of his own men, for the sake of control. The man who had taught him to fight for justice, to fight for what was right, had become a pawn in his own twisted game. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It was a betrayal of everything Jordan had ever believed in. Thorexia, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, suddenly stirred. Her eyes, still full of intelligence, despite the pain she had endured, turned toward Hayes. Her mandibles clicked softly, a sound that resonated with an unsettling calm. "You speak of control," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the pain she was still fighting. "But you underestimate what happens when you control everything. You forget what it is to truly live, to feel, to be free." Hayes's gaze flickered to her, and for a moment, something shifted in his expression. Perhaps it was the recognition of her strength, the acknowledgement that despite her injury, she was still a force to be reckoned with. But whatever it was, it quickly passed, replaced by the cold, calculating expression Jordan had come to hate. "You're wrong, Thorexia," Hayes said dismissively. "You've been used just like everyone else. The difference is, you'll never see it. The future has already been decided. And there's nothing you can do about it." The words were a death knell to everything Jordan had once believed. He felt a chill settle deep in his bones as Hayes's betrayal became clear, not just to him, but to everyone who had ever fought for peace. This war had never been about ending the conflict. It had always been about control. And in that moment, Jordan understood that Hayes had never cared about the future of humanity, or the Arachnids, or any of the soldiers who had died in the name of peace. He had cared only about power. Jordan's chest tightened as he looked at the man who had once been his commander. For the first time, he understood the true cost of betrayal. Hayes had manipulated not just the soldiers, but the very essence of what it meant to fight for something greater than oneself. The war, the lives lost, the blood spilled, all of it had been part of a game, a power play, and Jordan had been one of the pawns. And now, with the truth laid bare before him, there was only one thing left for Jordan to do: fight. Not just for his life, or Thorexia's, but for something greater. For the future. For a world where the cost of power was no longer measured in lives lost. It was a fight he never expected to face, but it was one he was ready for, because now he understood the true meaning of betrayal, and the cost of redemption. The moment Colonel Hayes stepped forward, the ground beneath Jordan seemed to shift. The air in the room, once thick with tension, now felt suffocating, as though the weight of his very presence was enough to collapse the fragile reality Jordan had been clinging to. This man, his former commander, his mentor, stood before him now as something completely unrecognizable. The shock of seeing Hayes, the one man he had trusted more than anyone, as an enemy, was a blow to Jordan's entire existence. His heart pounded, his body froze, and for a fleeting moment, it was as if everything around him blurred. Hayes had always been a symbol of strength, of leadership. The man who had led Jordan through countless battles, who had taught him to be a soldier, was now the one person Jordan never imagined could betray him. The realization hit like a sucker punch. Hayes wasn't just an officer, he was someone Jordan had believed in. He had followed this man into the darkest places, trusted him with his life, and believed that every order had been for a noble cause. But now, standing before him, Hayes was nothing more than a cold, calculating figure, someone who had played a part in the very betrayal that threatened to undo everything Jordan stood for. For a long moment, there was only silence between them, thick and unbearable. Jordan's chest tightened as Hayes's eyes locked with his, cold and unwavering. The man who had once given Jordan hope in the darkest of times now seemed like a stranger, one who had shed the very ideals that had once made him a hero in Jordan's eyes. "Surprised to see me, son?" Hayes's voice was steady, almost too calm, and it made the hairs on the back of Jordan's neck stand up. "You thought you were doing something noble, didn't you? Helping her, saving her. But you didn't see the bigger picture, did you?" Jordan's throat tightened as his mind scrambled to process the words. He had trusted Hayes with his life, with his future. But now, it was as if the man he had known had been replaced by someone else entirely, a person who no longer cared about honor, integrity, or what was right. Hayes wasn't just part of the machine anymore, he had become the machine itself, a puppet master pulling the strings behind the scenes. Jordan had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. "You think you're fighting for peace, don't you?" Hayes continued, stepping closer, his voice filled with an almost mocking pity. "But peace was never the goal. The goal was control. You've been too naive to see it, Jordan. You were always just a tool. You're still just a tool. All of us are. And the sooner you realize that, the sooner you'll understand how the world really works." The words felt like daggers to Jordan's heart. They tore through him, ripping away the last remnants of the trust he had placed in Hayes. He had believed in the mission, in the cause. He had believed that they were fighting for something greater than themselves, that their sacrifices meant something. But Hayes had just shattered that belief in an instant. The war had never been about peace. It had been about control. It had been about power. The people, the soldiers, everyone had been used as pieces in a game, and Jordan had been too blind to see it. "What do you want from me, Hayes?" Jordan's voice broke through the storm of emotions swirling inside him, his words barely audible, heavy with the weight of betrayal. "Why didn't you just leave it alone? Why drag me into this?" Hayes's lips curled into a thin smile, one that wasn't filled with any kind of warmth. "Leave it alone? No, Jordan, I needed you. I needed someone who still believed in the ideals, someone who would take the bait. And you did. You took it hook, line, and sinker. You thought you were doing something right by saving her, by trying to bring her back with you. But that's exactly what I needed. I needed someone like you to get close to the Queen. The Queen. Thorexia. The very reason Jordan had put everything on the line, the very reason he had made the choice to defy everything he had ever known. And now, Hayes's words twisted the very act of saving her into something ugly, something manipulative. Thorexia, who had become something of a symbol of hope in Jordan's heart, was nothing more than a tool in a larger game, one that Hayes had been playing from the start. The Queen had been a pawn all along, and so had Jordan. Hayes's eyes gleamed with something cold, something dark. "You didn't understand, did you? You thought you could change the rules of the game, but the game has always been the same. This isn't about good versus evil, Jordan. This isn't about saving lives or ending the war. This is about who controls the narrative, who controls the future. And now, with the Queen on our side, we can control everything. The peace talks, the truce, it's all just smoke and mirrors. We'll keep the war going, but we'll be the ones to decide how it ends. The words made Jordan's blood run cold. He had been fighting for peace, for an end to the suffering. But Hayes had been fighting for power all along. And Jordan had been so blind, so desperate to believe in something greater, that he had walked right into it. He had been part of Hayes's plan, part of a larger scheme that didn't care about the soldiers, didn't care about the lives lost. All that mattered was control. Hayes took another step forward, his gaze never leaving Jordan's. "You've been nothing more than a pawn in this game," he repeated, his voice low and almost reverent. "But now, you'll see the truth. You'll see that this war was never about us versus them. It was about power. And now, with Thorexia under our control, we'll have everything we need to finish this." Jordan's body went cold. He had been used. All the blood, all the sacrifices, all the death, it had been a game to Hayes. And now, with Thorexia in his hands, Hayes would hold all the cards. In that moment, Jordan realized the full extent of Hayes's betrayal. The man he had looked up to, the man he had trusted with his life, had never cared about honor or duty. He had cared only about power, about control. And Jordan had been nothing more than a pawn in his twisted game. The weight of it all settled in, suffocating him. His breath was shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. What had started as a mission to save the Queen, to end the war, had turned into something darker, something more complicated than Jordan could have ever imagined. And now, standing before him, Hayes wasn't just an enemy. He was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong with the war, the personification of the betrayal that had shaped it all. Jordan stood there, frozen, staring at Hayes as the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about redemption. And as he looked at the man who had once been his mentor, the anger inside him began to build. The betrayal was unbearable. But it was the truth, the harsh, bitter truth, that would define the battle ahead. And now, more than ever, Jordan knew that he had to fight. Not just for his own survival, but for something bigger. For the future. For a world where the lies, the manipulation, and the power games no longer held sway. The first crack of gunfire shattered the uneasy silence that had fallen between them. It was like a cruel reminder that the world outside this moment, outside the fragile bubble of their brief respite, was still a war zone. Jordan's heart raced as the sharp, staccato sounds of combat erupted around him. The once quiet air was now thick with the tension of what was to come. The relief of their brief conversation, of the revelation that Hayes was the real enemy, was fleeting. It lasted only a heartbeat before the reality of their situation crashed down like a weight. Jordan's instincts, honed by years of combat, kicked in without hesitation. His body moved before his mind had fully caught up, as if it had always known what was coming. His hand was already on the sidearm holstered at his waist, the cold metal a stark reminder of the fact that he wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting to protect something he had never expected, Thorexia, the queen of the arachnids, the very embodiment of his enemy. The moment the first shot rang out, it felt like everything they had worked for, the fragile truce they had briefly shared, was shattered. The sanctuary they thought they had found was no more than a temporary illusion, and now, with mercenaries closing in, the battle for their survival had begun. Jordan spun toward Thorexia, who was already struggling to rise, her body weakened but still filled with a quiet determination. The injury she had sustained earlier, while life-threatening, was not enough to break her will. There was something in the way she moved, even injured, that reminded him of her strength, a reminder that, despite everything, she was still a leader. She had led armies, commanded her people, and in that moment, her sharp gaze locked onto his with a single message: they had to fight. But the odds were stacked against them. The mercenaries who had entered the trading post were no mere foot soldiers, they were highly trained operatives, hired guns who had no loyalty to any cause other than their own. Their guns were aimed, their eyes cold, and their hands steady. Jordan had seen this kind of enemy before, the ones who fought not out of ideology but for profit, for survival. They didn't care who lived or died, as long as they walked away with a paycheck. They didn't care that they were in the presence of an arachnid queen. She was a target, just like Jordan was. The crackle of gunfire filled the air again, this time followed by the sound of a grenade landing nearby. The blast sent debris flying, forcing Jordan to take cover behind a stack of crates. His heart raced as the smoke and dust swirled around him, disorienting him. He could feel the pressure of time closing in, the certainty that they were running out of it. "Get down!" Jordan shouted to Thorexia, though he knew she could handle herself. He barely had time to duck before the deafening explosion rattled his senses. The world spun, and for a moment, everything was chaos. The only thing that grounded him was the steadying presence of the queen beside him, her movements calculated and precise despite her injuries. She was a warrior, perhaps more than he had ever been, certainly more than anyone had ever credited her for. The fighting intensified, and Jordan's senses sharpened as he scanned the area. He caught sight of the mercenaries advancing, their movements quick, fluid. They were experts, and in the chaos, they were making short work of the few remaining human soldiers who had tried to help him. Jordan's breath caught as he realized the full scope of the danger they were in. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and in an unfamiliar location with nowhere to go but forward. Thorexia's mandibles clicked softly as she looked at him. There was no fear in her eyes, only calculation, a sharpness that Jordan had come to respect. "I'll cover you," she said in her distorted English, the translator device embedded in her thorax struggling to keep up with the urgency in her voice. It was the first time she had spoken since the battle had started, and there was a weight in her words that settled into Jordan's chest like a heavy stone. She wasn't just offering to fight by his side. She was offering him something else, something much more meaningful. She was offering him a chance at survival, a chance at a victory that seemed impossible. He didn't have time to process the meaning of her words fully. Instead, he nodded, drawing his weapon and moving quickly toward the opening of the trading post. The battle was now their only reality. There was no time to think about alliances, no time to question the shifting dynamics of their relationship. They were partners in survival now, and that meant putting everything else aside. The mercenaries were closing in, their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridors of the post. Their leader, a hulking figure clad in black armor, moved toward them with deadly intent. His weapon gleamed in the low light, and Jordan's pulse quickened as he realized that, despite everything, despite the odds stacked against them, there was no other choice but to fight. Thorexia moved beside him, her body still carrying the weight of her injuries, but her presence was as fierce as ever. She moved with a predatory grace, her exoskeleton clicking in a rhythm that seemed almost synchronized with the battle around them. Jordan had seen her fight before, but never like this. She wasn't just defending herself, she was fighting for something bigger than herself. She was fighting for their lives, for the future, for everything they had worked to protect. The mercenaries advanced with precise movements, but they underestimated the two of them. Thoraxia's agility and power were a force to be reckoned with. She struck with a speed and ferocity that left the enemies stunned, her mandibles snapping with deadly accuracy as she incapacitated one mercenary after another. Jordan, too, fought with a renewed energy, his training kicking in as he dodged enemy fire, his focus sharp and unwavering. His movements were fluid, practiced. He wasn't just fighting for his survival. He was fighting to protect the one person who had become more than just an ally in that brief span of time. But even with their combined strength, they couldn't hold the line forever. The mercenaries were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. The tide of the battle shifted, and Jordan realized with a sinking heart that they were losing ground. Their ammunition was running low, and the smoke from the explosions was beginning to obscure their vision. In that moment of uncertainty, when the outcome seemed unclear, something shifted in Jordan. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about fighting off the mercenaries. It was about standing together, two forces, once enemies, now fighting for the same cause. The bond they had formed over the past days, however unlikely, had become the foundation of their strength. With one final, coordinated push, Jordan and Thoraxia broke through the enemy lines. The mercenaries scattered in disarray, not prepared for the fury they had unleashed. As the last of the attackers fell, Jordan found himself standing amidst the ruins of the trading post, his breath heavy in his chest, his body battered, but alive. Thoraxia stood beside him, her eyes never leaving him. There was no need for words in that moment. They had fought together, survived together, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that went beyond simple survival. It was something far more powerful, a partnership built on trust, mutual respect, and the understanding that, despite everything, they were no longer enemies. The battle was over, for now, but the fight for their future had only just begun. The battle had escalated quickly, and with every second, Jordan felt the weight of their survival pressing down harder. The trading post had become a war zone, its narrow corridors echoing with gunfire and the unmistakable sound of metal meeting flesh. Their small group had managed to hold their ground for a while, but it was becoming clear that they couldn't keep it up much longer. The mercenaries, relentless and trained for exactly this kind of chaos, had the upper hand. They were closing in, their movements calculated, methodical, an unstoppable force. Jordan's chest heaved with each breath, his body battered from the relentless fight. His ammunition was running low, his body aching, and his mind was becoming clouded with exhaustion. Every step forward was a struggle, every shot fired felt like a gamble. He had barely managed to keep up with the onslaught, and now, with the mercenaries closing in on all sides, it felt like the end was near. Thoraxia, though still a formidable force in her own right, had also been wearing down. Her injuries, though nothing short of miraculous in their survival, were beginning to take their toll. She fought fiercely, but even her strength was not infinite. The reality of their situation was suffocating. Jordan glanced at Thoraxia, whose exoskeleton, cracked and stained, still held the remnants of its once pristine armor. Her movements were slower now, each step a battle against her own pain. Yet, her resolve never wavered. Her eyes locked with his, a silent promise passing between them. She was still fighting, still pushing forward, but Jordan knew they couldn't do this alone much longer. It wasn't just their survival that mattered now, it was everything they had fought for, the possibility of peace, the hope that things could change. But as the sound of mercenary boots grew louder, Jordan realized that, perhaps for the first time, they were truly alone. The weight of the situation hit him harder than ever before. There were no more soldiers to back them up, no reinforcements on the way. Just the two of them, fighting to the bitter end. A wave of hopelessness crashed over him. He felt it in his bones, the realization that this might be the end. He had always been prepared for death, had always known that war had a way of taking everything, but this was different. This was a fight that could mean more than just their lives, it could define the future of their entire species, the course of their very existence. Thorexia caught his eye, her expression unchanging, but there was something in the way she looked at him, an understanding. They had both known that this mission, this bond, was bigger than them. They had crossed lines that had never been meant to be crossed. But that didn't matter anymore. They were on the brink of something far more important than survival, a chance for change, for hope in a world that seemed determined to devour itself. And then, just as the sound of mercenaries advancing became deafening, something unexpected happened. A burst of gunfire rang out from the rear of the post, sharp and precise. Jordan spun around, instinctively raising his weapon, ready for whatever new threat had emerged. But instead of enemies, he saw something else, something far more welcome. A group of figures, dressed in the unmistakable uniforms of the 103rd Battalion, stormed through the door, guns raised and firing with deadly accuracy. It was a sight Jordan had almost given up on, a rescue, a lifeline thrown in the middle of chaos. The air shifted instantly, the tide of battle turning in their favor. The mercenaries, caught off guard by the sudden intervention, faltered, their ranks scattering as the unexpected force arrived with the fury of a storm. Jordan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the face at the front of the unit. Sergeant Mason, the very man who had fought beside him during some of the darkest days of the war, the man who had never let him down. And now, here he was, leading a team of reinforcements right when it seemed like there was no way out. Mason's eyes met Jordan's from across the room, a silent understanding passing between them. There was no need for words, the actions spoke louder than any command ever could. The 103rd was here, and they were going to fight, no matter what it took. With renewed strength, Jordan and Thorexia joined the fray once more, but this time, the weight of the battle had shifted. The reinforcements moved with precision, covering the flanks, picking off the mercenaries one by one. The crack of gunfire, once a sound of terror, now felt like the rhythm of a symphony, a rhythm of survival, of defiance. Every movement felt deliberate, every shot fired with purpose. The mercenaries, once the dominant force, were now scattered and disoriented. In the midst of the chaos, Jordan found himself standing next to Thorexia once again. They fought side by side, the bond between them now unspoken but clear. She had once been his enemy, a symbol of everything he had been trained to hate. But now, they were more than that. They were allies, partners, fighting for something beyond the war, beyond their differences. They fought for the chance to shape their futures, to rewrite the story that had been dictated to them by the powers that be. And as the battle raged around them, Jordan knew they had a chance, a real chance, to change everything. The reinforcements continued to push forward, and the mercenaries, overwhelmed and outnumbered, began to retreat. The tide of the battle had shifted in their favor, and though there were still a few skirmishes left to fight, the outcome had been decided. As the last of the enemy forces fell, Jordan's breath finally slowed. The adrenaline that had coursed through his veins began to ebb away, leaving him exhausted but alive. He turned to Thorexia, who was standing beside him, her posture still regal despite her injuries. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with something deeper than just relief. It was a quiet respect, a recognition that, despite everything, they had made it through together. For the first time since they had met, Jordan didn't see an enemy when he looked at her. He saw a warrior, a survivor, and someone who, like him, had been shaped by the violence and the chaos of the war. The fighting had stopped, but the journey wasn't over. They had been given a second chance, one that neither of them had expected, but one they would seize with everything they had left. Together, they stood amidst the wreckage, the dust still settling in the air, and the knowledge that the battle for survival was far from over. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. In the quiet that followed the storm of gunfire, Jordan allowed himself a moment of clarity. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for a future he never could have imagined when this journey began. And whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. They had a chance, and that was all that mattered. The silence that followed the battle was almost as suffocating as the chaos had been. The air hung heavy with the scent of smoke and blood, the remnants of the fight still lingering in the corners of the trading post. The dust had settled, but the weight of what had just happened, the alliance that had formed in the heat of battle, hung in the air like a tangible thing. Thorexia stood beside Jordan, her body battered, her exoskeleton cracked, but her presence unyielding. It was in this moment, after the fighting had ended, that the true weight of their survival began to settle in. Jordan's eyes scanned the aftermath of the battle, dead mercenaries, fallen comrades, and the wreckage of the place that had once seemed like a safe haven. Yet, despite the bloodshed, despite the destruction, there was something else present in the air now, the undeniable sense of change. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but everything had shifted. The war, the violence, the years of hatred, none of it seemed to matter in the same way anymore. He had crossed a line, and in doing so, he had found something far greater than survival. He had found a connection, a bond with the one person he had never imagined would stand by his side. Thorexia turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the fog of war that still clouded their minds. There was no need for words, no need for grand speeches or declarations. In that moment, their gaze was enough. Everything they had been through, the battles, the betrayals, the sacrifices, had led to this. A moment of understanding, a moment of unity. The future they fought for was no longer about defeating the enemy, but about forging something new, something that could transcend the war, the violence, the hatred. Jordan could feel the weight of that understanding settle into his chest. He had always thought of himself as a soldier, as someone who fought for a cause. But now, he realized that the cause he had fought for had never been the right one. He had been conditioned to believe in an ideology that was built on division, built on hatred. But now, standing beside Thorexia, he saw something different. Something more powerful than the war they had been waging. He saw the possibility of a new beginning. The future, as it had always been defined, was no longer relevant. The old ways, the old rules, none of it mattered anymore. They had torn down those walls, and in doing so, they had forged a path that could lead to something better. A future where peace wasn't just a fleeting dream, but a reality that could be built through understanding, through compassion, through unity. Thorexia's mandibles clicked softly as she spoke, her voice low but filled with a quiet authority that Jordan had come to respect. "You saved me, Jordan," she said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. "And in doing so, you have given me a chance to survive. But more than that, you have given both of our peoples a chance at something more." Her words resonated deeply within him, and Jordan realized that she wasn't just speaking to him as an ally. She was speaking to him as a leader, as someone who understood the magnitude of what they had just done. They had crossed boundaries, broken down walls that had stood for generations. And now, they had the power to rebuild. Together, they could shape a future where their species, their people, could coexist, not as enemies, not as conquerors and the conquered, but as equals. The idea seemed impossible, almost absurd, but as he looked into her eyes, he knew that it was not only possible, it was necessary. Jordan's breath caught in his throat as he thought about the future. He had always been a soldier, trained to fight, to kill, to survive. But now, standing on the precipice of something new, something that could change the course of history, he realized that his purpose was no longer defined by war. It was defined by this moment, by the bond he had formed with Thorexia, and by the possibility of creating something better, something worth fighting for. In that silence, Jordan knew what had to come next. The war was over. It was time for the world to know that everything had changed. The declaration they had made on the battlefield, the unity they had forged in the heat of battle, was only the beginning. It was time to show the world that there was another way, that peace was not just a distant dream but something that could be achieved if they were willing to fight for it, together. Jordan turned to Thorexia, his heart steady but filled with a new kind of purpose. "We can't do this alone," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. "But together, we can change everything. We can make sure that this war, this endless cycle of hatred, ends here. We can show everyone that peace is possible." Thorexia's eyes softened, and for a moment, she seemed to hesitate. But then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she nodded. "Then let us declare it," she said, her voice resolute. "Let us be the beginning of something new." Jordan felt the weight of her words settle over him like a mantle, but it was not a burden. It was a responsibility, a purpose. They had chosen this path, this difficult, dangerous, and uncertain path. But it was the only one that mattered. They had the chance to shape the future, to rewrite the narrative of their people. It was a chance that few ever received, and it was one that Jordan knew he couldn't waste. And so, in that moment, amidst the wreckage of a war-torn world, Jordan made a silent vow. He would not allow the horrors of the past to define the future. He would fight, not just for survival, but for a world where peace could flourish. And he would do it with Thorexia by his side, not as an enemy, but as a partner. Together, they would make this declaration, not just for themselves, but for every life that had been lost in the name of war. The moment of truth had come. The declaration was not just about what they would do next, it was about everything they had been through to get here. It was about their survival, their bond, and their shared commitment to a future that could be different. This was the beginning. And it was a beginning worth fighting for. The world had changed in ways that Jordan could never have anticipated, and as he stood there with Thorexia, looking out over the battlefield they had just survived, the weight of that change was settling in. The smoke of the battle still hung in the air, the remnants of chaos now blending with an eerie sense of peace. In the distance, the sounds of distant explosions and the cries of soldiers faded away. For a moment, it felt as if time had paused, holding its breath in the face of something monumental. The world they had fought for, the peace they had risked everything to achieve, was still uncertain, but one thing was clear, it was within their grasp. They had crossed lines that had never been meant to be crossed, two enemies, two forces that had spent years locked in conflict, now standing side by side, united in a cause greater than any of them had imagined. The battlefield had been their crucible, but it was also where they had forged something that transcended war. Jordan had come to understand, perhaps for the first time, that peace wasn't something to be won or lost. It wasn't about defeating the enemy, it was about finding common ground, even when that ground seemed impossible to find. Thorexia, standing next to him, was no longer just the enemy queen. She wasn't the symbol of destruction or the embodiment of everything Jordan had been trained to fight against. She was something far more complicated, far more human than he had ever expected. She was a leader, a survivor, a being who had seen her people ravaged by conflict, just as his people had been. And, in some strange way, their suffering had brought them together, not as enemies, but as allies. He turned to her, watching her closely as she stood there, her gaze steady and unflinching, despite the injuries she had endured. Her exoskeleton, though cracked and battered, still carried a quiet majesty, a reminder of the power she wielded as a queen. But what struck him most was the softness in her eyes, the vulnerability that had emerged in the weeks they had spent together. She was no longer the terrifying figure that had once seemed so distant and alien. She was someone he could understand, someone he could trust. "I never thought this would happen," Jordan said quietly, his voice filled with wonder. "I never thought that I'd be standing here, by your side, after everything we've been through." Thorexia's eyes softened, and for the first time since their meeting, there was a flicker of something warmer in her gaze, something that mirrored the understanding between them. "Nor did I," she replied, her voice low but filled with a quiet strength. "But perhaps that is the only way forward. Perhaps our people, our species, have spent too long fighting for the wrong reasons. We've been locked in a cycle of destruction. It is time to break it." Jordan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. It was true. Everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in, had been based on the idea of winning, of defeating the other side. But as he looked at her now, as he stood in this moment of shared resolve, he knew that victory wasn't the answer. It never had been. Victory meant nothing if it came at the cost of everything else. It was unity, not victory, that would determine their future. Unity beyond war, beyond conflict, beyond the hatred that had defined their lives for so long. For a moment, Jordan allowed himself to reflect on everything that had brought him here. He had joined the military with the hope of serving something greater, of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. But along the way, he had lost sight of the bigger picture. He had become entrenched in the idea of war, of fighting for the sake of fighting, without ever considering what peace might look like. And now, standing beside Thorexia, the truth of that failure was undeniable. He had been fighting for a future defined by division, and it had taken him a long time to realize that the real fight was not against the enemy. It was against the systems that had taught him to view the world in black and white. Thorexia's words brought him back to the present, grounding him in the reality of what lay ahead. "We cannot undo the past," she said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "But we can shape the future. Together. Our peoples have been divided for so long, but we now have the opportunity to show them that we are stronger together. It will not be easy. The road ahead will be long, and the scars of our past will not disappear overnight. But if we stand united, if we fight for what is right, we can build a future where our differences are no longer a source of conflict but a source of strength." The weight of her words settled heavily in Jordan's chest. The future wasn't something that could be handed to them. It wasn't something that would just appear. It would take work. It would take effort. And, most of all, it would take courage, the courage to step beyond the boundaries of their old lives and into something new, something unknown. Jordan glanced at the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break. The battle was over, but the war for their future had just begun. The peace they had fought for was fragile, but it was theirs to shape. It was up to them, to both of their species, to choose what came next. They had the chance to build a new world, one where the mistakes of the past didn't define their future, one where their differences were celebrated, not feared. Thoraxia's mandibles clicked softly, a sound that once might have filled him with dread, but now seemed like a quiet affirmation of the bond they shared. Together, she repeated, her voice strong and unwavering. This is the beginning of something new. Not just for us, but for all who come after us. Jordan looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her not as a queen or an enemy, but as a partner. They had both been shaped by war, by pain, by loss. But they had also been shaped by something far stronger than any of that, hope. Hope for a world that was no longer defined by the violence of the past, but by the possibility of something better. Together, they would build that world. They would forge a future where survival was not enough, where the fight was not just for peace, but for a future where everyone, regardless of species, of past allegiances, had a place. They would stand together, as equals, as partners, as a symbol of what could be accomplished when the lines between enemy and ally were erased, when the bonds of unity and understanding were forged in the fires of adversity. The battle had been won, but the real fight, the fight for a future together, was just beginning. And this time, it was a fight they would face side by side. The world might have been shaped by war, but it would be shaped by their unity moving forward. For Jordan and Thoraxia, it was no longer just about survival. It was about building something that would outlast the conflict, a future that would live on long after the battle was over.